so excited today to have an opportunity to speak to Vilas Dhar, who's here with me, an expert on AI, but also someone who's really invested in how we can create policy that helps us govern AI in an equitable, sustainable way. So Vilas, welcome.
Thank you so much, Rorry. It's a delight to be here.
I'm so glad to have you. I wanted to start maybe just a little bit about how you came to these ideas that there is an upside for these disruptive technologies that are so often sold to us as major risks.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be in this industry.
Thanks, Rorry. What a great question. And again, it's just so nice to be with you here at the Asia Society. I never set out to be an expert on AI policy or a prophet of the goodness of technology. And my experience in this came from a much more visceral and personal experience. I grew up here in the United States, but the son of immigrants from India. And I was very lucky in a childhood that wasn't particularly privileged to have time to be able to go back and spend time with that family in very rural parts of the world. Much of my family was outside of Bangalore in a very small village. I'd go and I would have this experience of realizing the kind of visceral reality of people's lives, the challenges they faced that felt so far away from where I was growing up in rural Illinois. They didn't really have digital technologies at scale at the time. I mean, I remember there was one telephone booth in the entire village that you had to go and queue for in order to get on a phone call. And I could contrast that with where I was growing up, a place where I was already able to experience supercomputers and all kinds of things in a very odd kind of coincidence of time and geography. I grew up very close to the National Center for Supercomputing. Mm-hmm. And the story I took from this wasn't, hey, technology is great. It was the difference in the quality of life for those who had access and those who didn't. And this 40-odd years ago, brought forward into the world today, still exists in almost exactly the same ways. A digital divide where much of the world enjoys the incredible commercial and market opportunities that come from access to technology writ large, and the rest of the world. A set of people with shared dignity and common interests and values who are still trying to figure out how to succeed in a world when they just don't have basic access. So that was the starting point, Rorry. It was an understanding that technology does have lots to contribute. But the story of technology is very rarely going to be about what products we innovate. It's going to be about whether we make core commitments in our society to making sure that everybody can benefit from them. And that started me on a path that will take us to, I know, many of the policy elements that we might talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk just a little bit about an overview of what you think we should prioritize when it comes to closing the digital divide. I mean, you work for a foundation that is heavily invested in this topic, but I'd like to hear kind of, as you travel the world, you're a global traveler on the road most of the year, what do you think are the top priorities for the things that policymakers could do to help bridge that divide?
I want to start at the macro level with an analysis of the problem.
Okay.
Too often we say the challenge with the digital divide is investment in infrastructure, or is a particularly commercial way of thinking about whether everybody has access. But I think there's a different starting point to the question of the digital divide that has to start with core agency and participation and dignity. When I talk to people all around the world, in small towns here in the United States and in rural villages across Asia or Africa, there's a common sense that technology is something that's being created and used far away from where we live. It's being created by people who don't look like us, who don't think like us, who don't participate in the same communities that we do. And then there is some sort of magical expectation of a trickle-down effect where somehow that's going to benefit the rest of us.
Right. It's like an alien landing in their community and saying, this is how we do things. Instead of working with them in a partnership.
That's exactly right. And I'll give you a very clear example of this. And we've seen it with the incredible growth of mobile phones and technology like that. And now it's hard to go to any corner of the world where people don't have access to mobile phones. But when I talk to people about it, of course they love and benefit from the many things it lets them do. But you still often hear them say, but I didn't have a voice in creating it.
Right.
These tools weren't built for me. I just get to be a consumer of them. To me,
passive.
It's passive, and it actually feels almost like an expression of a foreign power, right? Somebody else who has built a thing and told me I can take it or leave it.
Right.
This is the point I think we need to start from the digital divide. Is not, does everybody have access, but rather, does everybody feel a common and shared sense of ownership in a vision of what technology might make possible for the world? If we were to start there instead, if we said that the digital divide is about making sure that every person on the planet feels like they're an owner in our shared digital future, we'd have a different starting point for policy, but also for technological capacity, for where it sits and how we invest in its future. Now, that's a very broad statement. So let me take us then to what I spend a lot of my day thinking about, which is particularly in this emergent frontier of AI technology. How do we make sure that we don't propagate the same kinds of divisions that were created by the internet or social media? And AI is a really unique technology. You know, we're often stuck in a public conversation about generative AI, which has captured the imagination, right? But AI really is a broad suite of technologies that cover everything from the ways that we interact with language, generative AI and large language models, but also to how we think about supply chains, how we think about decisions about the delivery of services, about a full digital experience of how people engage with any number of activities that they might do in their daily lives. And today, I'm going to tell you, we are still stuck in a public headlines narrative that says these technologies are being created by a small set of private technology companies.
Right.
But it's not what I see when I travel around the world. When I talk to folks in communities, I say, what would you really love it if AI could do for you? The kinds of questions, the kinds of answers I get are not, I wish I could have one more chatbot. But instead, people saying things like, you know, I don't know very much about AI, but I do know that I find it very hard to decide when I should go into my fields and plant rice, when I should harvest, when I should go to the market to get the best price. They say, you know, our villages actually have an ongoing risk of mudslides and landslides. And no matter how much we've asked governments or experts, they haven't really been able to give us tools that let us predict these things more effectively.
Right.
Or coastal communities that say, you know, our mangroves are eroding and we don't know what we should be doing to protect them.
Right.
And then the second part of that, when we're able to tie those questions, those community learnings, those understandings of problems at scale with technical resources, often graduate students in AI at local universities or local nonprofits that have built an AI capacity, and they build a solution to that local problem that that community can deploy and own, you see a transformation of that fundamental question of digital dignity. You see villagers who are so proud to show me on their phones the app that was built with AI. They feel like they're a part of an AI transformation of our world. The question for me, Rory, becomes how do we do this at scale? How do we invest in this kind of transformation using every tool at our disposal to make sure that every person on the planet feels like AI isn't something being done to them or even something that's being done for them, but actually something that's being done by them?
So I have a follow-up question to that, which is then how?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that this is not just about perhaps like AI and what it means. This is really about technology becoming a part of our like shared human experience, right? So the things that you're talking about as you participate in the building of AI, as you solve your own problems using the technology, it really comes back to that kind of human security. What is the lived experience of technology, which I think I agree is a conversation that's missing in our media and in our culture. But it's also still a hard topic to kind of wrap your head around. So how do we do it?
Well, you're absolutely right that it's a hard topic. And one of the reasons why is because we've shaped a public conversation over 40 plus years around technology that minimizes human agency. This was a starting point in some of our conversations at the United Nations. The Secretary General asked me to join a high-level advisory body on AI. And he gave us a 3-part mandate. He said, look, understand, but help us communicate what the risks are with these technologies. Fine. But then he asked us to do the exact opposite. He said, but also let us come up with a feeling of what the opportunities are with them. And then recommend the institutions and approaches that might help us advance a better future. To me, the starting point, as we've talked about, is moving from a conversation where technology is done far away to done in communities. And how do we do that? Well, I think there are a number of ways that we could do it. The first is to, at a macro scale, restructure the conversation from a reaction to what technology is making possible to building the capacity for a proactive vision of the same thing. To work with policymakers and legislators to say, let's not just worry about overreach by private sector actors, but to really envision what governments could do if they had access to technology at scale. We do this work in a very applied way through the foundation and institution that I represent, leading programs to educate and support policymakers, certainly in the global north, but across the world in partnership with institutions like UNESCO and the Thomson Reuters Foundation to invest in building national AI capacity planning
Right.
but also to train civil society, journalists and lawyers in those countries to say what's possible when we think about new and positive reframings of AI. The second is to really consider this question of where capacity lies to build AI at scale. It is absolutely the case today that the vast majority of compute capacity sits inside of private companies. But at the same time, much of that capacity is being used to do something quite hyper-specific, to build larger and larger AI generative models and large languages, right?
To sell to people.
To sell to people, to build commercial outcomes. And that's not in any way to minimize the ways that companies are also building public purpose products.
Sure.
But let's acknowledge that that's not their primary reason for existence, right? But we're seeing something else happen. We're seeing the creation of local capacity around compute that's not just about building the flashiest, shiniest model, but building real solutions to problems in ways that leverage where emergent AI is. Not every problem needs to have a 3 trillion parameter large language model attached to it.
Sure.
So we're seeing this evolution of small, concentrated, made-for-purpose models emerging, where you might have something like a question like, how do we predict a weather model? This is a fascinating little subject. If you don't mind, we'll do a quick diversion on it.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
You know, for the last, I'd say half a century, we've invested so much as a global community in weather prediction. As you well know, this affects so many people's welfare and their basic rights and dignity, right?
Yeah, and it's also changing so quickly because of climate change and extreme weather events.
Exactly right. The ways that we do weather prediction go back to a core set of theories around physics-based models that have been around for a while. And we get better at weather prediction by the year by throwing more and more compute capacity at these old school models.
Okay.
Something like a vast majority of the world's high performance compute today is used to predict the weather, and it affects every person on the planet. In just the last few months, a series of papers have emerged in Nature and in other places that demonstrate that you can use an AI-based model to predict the weather.
Right.
That not only can you do it about as well as high-performance compute-based physics models do, but actually significantly better. That you can get more days of clarity using a very simple AI model that's trained on a pretty limited set of data. Now, I don't want to get too technically wonky, but let me tell you why I think this is fascinating. Because if we could build AI-based models that predict the weather and give us, let's say, 15 days of accurate forecasting instead of 9 or 10, we'd give communities an extra 4 or 5 days to prepare for typhoons, for hurricanes, for massive climatic impacts. But here's a corollary. If we actually found that we could use these AI models that are so specialized and decentralized to do this, we could free up so much of the supercomputing infrastructure in the world today that's used for physics models. Think about what we could do if we could offer to scientists and application developers around the world massive amounts of supercomputing and say, we no longer need to use this exclusively for weather. Come up with other applications that advance the human welfare. Come up with soil models that let us understand subsistence farming better. Come up with economic models that let us understand trade between massive producers and massive importers. All kinds of topics. Local capacity is the key, along with building local models that let us do AI at scale to transform the world.
So I could see, it's just fascinating to think about the decentralization of this and all of the capacity that it could unlock. I could use, first of all, because it's using so much more of the world's available capacity, but also unlock compute power. But there's always this tension between, localizing and decentralizing and then sharing best practices, sharing use cases across a number of different areas so that if there is a really great innovation on soil consistency in a rural area in Indonesia, it can be used in India, it can be used in the United States, anywhere around the world. How do you then reconnect? If you were able to do this, let's say we live in the world where governments have made investments in public compute infrastructure, another topic I'd like to address with you. And everybody is taking their own go at building use cases and models for purpose. How to bring them back together so that they can be shared?
This is an incredibly powerful observation you're making, Rory, that what you're pointing to is the fact that outside of academic institutions, we've not really built the public infrastructure for knowledge sharing and best practices around AI.
Yes.
And there are reasons why this has happened, and there are reasons that we can point to with relative economic certainty. The power of private sector concentration of technical capacity and the commercial protection of advancements on so many domains that could have had massive effects on human welfare. So what do we need to do to change it? Well, in the UN report that I mentioned earlier and in the Global Digital Compact, which a number of countries passed at the recent UN convening, one of the recommendations that's made is for joint capacity building networks.
Okay.
To recommend not merely the fact that we need a single institution or a single set of institutions that do this, but really to invest at multilateral scale and national scale and at commercial and domestic scale in building methods and mechanisms to share data, to share new models, to share compute access through collective mechanisms, and of course, emerging from this to build a new idea of what sharing and collaboration and best practices in AI would look like. We do this today organically, right? At the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, we work with universities around the world and nonprofits and scholars who are building AI models, certainly, but maybe much more importantly, AI-based practices to bring together how we actually conceptualize problems at scale, how we build data sets to address them that still leverage community power, and then build new ways to experience and share out the outcomes of that. What we could do is take this microcosm of communities of practice and build it into new infrastructure. And I particularly think about the fact that from a global north perspective, this feels maybe less important. There are mechanisms where this happens already. There are conferences around AI skills. There are consortiums of nonprofits. But when we take it out to a global frame and we begin to think about the geopolitics of AI, then to me, this idea of building connective tissue in AI becomes incredibly powerful. Why? Because I think at a geopolitical scale, we're beginning to face the fragmentation of how we approach AI design.
Yes.
These are ideological differentiators from the idea of truly democratic and open source access to much more authoritarian or surveillance-based uses. Underlying all of these different applications are fundamental questions about data ownership, about privacy, about representations of personal interests. And if we live in a world where we deeply silo technical capacity, where we don't build these mechanisms of connection, then what we see are the emergence of multiple walled gardens with very different ideological groundings. And we can talk a bit more about this, but to me, this is one of the great threats of an AI future. I'm rarely worried about Skynet and Terminators and robots that will kill us all. I am, if you ask me about AI risk, I will share with you that I'm deeply concerned about a world in which we fragment and silo the capacity of AI to do good in the world, and instead propagate a culture that promotes economic inequality, that promotes governmental and political repression, and a number of other human ills.
Yeah, okay, let's talk a little bit about all of those things because you've brought up a number of topics that we deal with all of the time in our work on security and trade, and even climate. I mean, across the board, what we're seeing at the Asia Society Policy Institute is that mistrust, not only between countries, but mistrust inside countries of their own governments is blocking some of the capacity for governments to play an organizing role in the way that you suggested. So multiple kind of layers of the distrust issue here. I think all kind of stemming back to who owns and controls the data and the mechanisms for sharing this technology. Where do you suggest we start kind of unpacking this? We've talked about AI potentially, like the worst risk of it being that it amplifies some of these divisions and divides that we see in social media or that we see in tech in general. What do you suggest? How do we start kind of attacking the problem of trust? And can AI be a trust-building mechanism rather than an amplification of all of this mistrust that we're feeling inside?
This is a fascinating conversation, Rory, and I appreciate that you're getting to all of these core topics. I think this one is right at the heart of it. And I think in many ways it is the best example of the intersectionality of what AI is causing in political change. Let me tell you what I mean by that. There's certainly an element of this that's around technological competency, innovation, and capacity. You mentioned access to data. I think that's quite important. But we should also acknowledge a world in which there's inequitable access to chips that actually drive the hardware that allows AI capacity to happen.
Yeah, and that access is going to be getting worse and worse as the United States and China are competing in an economic competition about who makes those chips.
Competition around who makes the chips, around who's able to export and import them, about whether there's third-party capacity that's coming online around the world that might change the way we think about chip manufacture to begin with. But again, each of these threads, the access to chips, the access to data, the access to the talent and the international scientific community that allows us to create it, all kind of lie in a bundle of technology questions. But I want to zoom out a little bit to really talk about the intersections of a few other things that have happened. One is I think we're also seeing these challenges around the core competency of multilateral institutions to be able to guide these challenges and conversations. You know, we talk often about the pace of change in our society because of technology, but really to think of that as a single phenomenon is to misalign with the complexity of the issue. We've seen deep transformation in our markets. We've seen transformation in supply chains. We see maybe lagging transformation in the institutions that are supposed to safeguard us from these changes. And so I think this piece also is worth considering is even as we invest in technological innovation, who's investing in the innovation of our multilateral processes to actually allow for governments and the institutions that represent them to sustain the kind of policy changes that are not merely reactive but proactive. And the third element of this, I think, is the societal one. This question of misinformation, which you brought up, which I think is a harbinger of a much broader phenomenon around a basic and fundamental distance between those who are seeing economic transformation and progress and those who feel like they are experiencing the benefits of it. Right? A fragmentation of the idea that, sure, we can do amazing things as humanity, but if my personal situation feels worse to me today than it did a year ago, then why would I be aligned to the idea that that's great for humanity? Now, AI plays an interesting role in this space. Many years ago, you know, I started my work in AI 25 years ago as a researcher. The common optimism among a very small community of us who were AI experts was the idea of economic cornucopia. The idea that AI solutions would create an abundance because we would be able to essentially produce goods at marginal or no cost, that we'd be able to create a Star Trek-like future where everybody could go to a replicator and get whatever they wanted. I think that vision seems further away today than it did 25 years ago. But it's not because the technology hasn't realized its promise. It's because we're living in a complex and multipolar world where it feels like recognizing those benefits may not be the priorities of governments or of private actors as they think about what technologies to build. Here's where I would suggest a few starting points in how we might address this. The first is to continue to invest in this idea that AI can do more than create commercial efficiencies. When I speak with boards and CEOs, I often think of the questions that I get in the first turn of that conversation as, how do we do the things that we do today better? And I think that's a fair starting point. It's a story about optimization, about efficiency, about supply chain transformation. But I wonder what happens when we get to the second part of the conversation, which is to say, let's stop thinking about how we do things better and think about doing better things. The idea that AI could actually transform some of the fundamental assumptions we have. I delivered a paper just last week at the Vatican on economic scarcity, on the idea that so much of our economic system is built on the idea that we can only produce so much and we have to think of ways to allocate it in ways that will be, by definition, inequitable. Well, what if we could talk about a world where the sources of production of basic goods, of agricultural goods, of food and medicine, were driven by AI in such a way that it dropped the cost curve and made them nearly universally accessible? How would that change our healthcare system? How would it change our fundamental assumptions about health equity and health justice? How would it change the ways we make decisions about making sure that everybody participates?
Right, so it allows us to kind of like scale up the things that we're already doing into more efficient, effective structures, probably freeing up some human capital too, to like learn new things, to contribute in a different way to the betterment of society, and however we do that. Let's talk a little bit about digital public infrastructure, because I think that that connects to this trust issue, probably, and also this sense that maybe governments are taking a step back, or they feel constrained in their role in promoting technological development in society because it's in the purview of the tech companies, because maybe they don't understand the fundamental codes inside the technology. But of course, there's this opportunity to do things in digital public infrastructure that countries of Asia are taking up at a higher rate than, I would say, countries of the global north. So in India, you know, having a digital ID, that seems very kind of like low-hanging fruit for any country to implement. Creating digital payment processing systems that are publicly accessible. Otherwise accessing services or creating modalities in which government data is given to people to optimize on their own. Why is that happening in developing and industrializing countries and not in countries that are developed and industrialized that have created this kind of general purpose technology but don't seem to want to use it for a general purpose?
Well, the phenomenon's particularly compelling. I think in a recent Deloitte study, we saw something like the rate of generative AI adoption in Asian countries in particular is about 40% greater than their counterparts in the global north. I think we're seeing a number of reasons why this happens. One is we're seeing incredible innovation that's coming out of governments, but also out of the associated private and civil sectors in Asian countries, where the idea is not merely to say, let's have governments roll out complex and sophisticated technology solutions, but instead to say, what we really need are operating rules of the road. We need the core infrastructure that lets us have open transactions, that lets us build the mechanisms by which merchants and suppliers and consumers can participate in an ecosystem. If you think about it, this is actually a fundamental role of government going back 400 years in the conception of what governments should do in markets, right? If you go to Adam Smith, what the core theories of economics that drive our modern structure say is not that you should have entirely free markets, but that you should have free markets with government regulation that allow for this commonality of participation. Now, this is happening, I think, in a particularly interesting way in Asia, where you're seeing governments step forward and recognize that in order to leapfrog the kind of adaptive evolution of markets to technology, what we need are very clear statements about how participants should engage in a digital infrastructure. You mentioned some of the core pieces, right? The idea of what I still consider to be quite important, self-sovereign, but some form of digital identity that allows an individual to engage and have access to a wide variety of digital services. Open ecosystem and infrastructure that allows many different stakeholders to engage through various APIs and be able to participate in a common space. And I think maybe fundamentally what's happening, I think now across a number of our partners in Asian countries is an openness to saying this should not be a country by country mechanism. That we need open connectors that actually allow for both the free flow of goods, materials, and trade, but also the free flow of data with trust, right? The idea, and if you go back to kind of Kyoto and some of the interesting agreements that have happened in the progeny of those original meetings, the idea of free flow of data with trust that has become, I think, an embedded principle in much of DPI work. Now, we still face some real obstacles here. One is when we come to AI in the context of digital public infrastructure, we don't yet have robust models on what that might look like. Right? We still know that the evolution of AI-related products and services, we are so in the early days that we're not quite sure where exactly the interventions will be that say, these are standalone interventions that need to have consumer-facing impact. Much of what we see today is still what I think of as kind of in the background. It's the optimization of manufacturing processes and supply chains and market pricing. And this work needs to happen. It needs to be built into the digital infrastructure of tomorrow's society, but not necessarily in ways that need to be transparent to an individual consumer, but rather need to be transparent to the system in ways that guarantee equity, access, and fairness.
Going back to kind of the idea of a digital ID, trust, et cetera, it strikes me that so many people have said, data is the new oil, data is the new commodity. And of course, like data is what is running all of this optimization. You're optimizing based on sets of data. And a lot of times that's data that we are kind of voluntarily giving to companies, corporations, governments, private actors to play with, to find new solutions for. How should we think about the ownership of our personal data? Is that model of kind of just giving our personal data away in some form? How do we kind of transform that into data for the public good? Or are we just kind of stuck thinking that we're passive actors in this data collection as well?
Yeah. Well, just a couple of weeks ago, I defended my PhD thesis, Rory, and you have committed the cardinal sin, which is asking somebody a question that's so linked to their thesis that I could talk to you for 8 hours about it. I promise I will not do that with you.
We can do that another time, because I would be fascinated by it, but still.
Let me share a couple of thoughts with you. I think the existing paradigms of how we've thought about personal data fit into a few classes, right? There's a model of privacy protection that I want to make sure that my data doesn't give somebody a tool to invade my personal dignity, and so I have a privacy interest in it. That's painting in very broad strokes here. That's a very European conception of privacy, right? There's a second, which is broadly an American conception, which is a property-based view, right? That I have economic rights in my data, and I should be able to exert those rights. And if you're going to do something with my data, I should benefit from it. Mm-hmm. There's a third, which I think is a view that's often held more in the global majority and certainly in Asian countries, which is the idea of collective interests in data. Okay. That it's not merely an expression of my personal interest, but also there are public purpose and public policy uses of our shared data that might lead to good outcomes.
Right, like I might have a disease and I found some sort of innovative cure for it, and sharing that data would help somebody else with the same condition.
Exactly,
like that type of use case. Okay.
And even if we are thinking about something like response to a prospective pandemic, being able to have the data about how it's affecting many will help us find solutions. Okay. Now, in this landscape, there are some real challenges that emerge very quickly. Those are the primary ways you think about it. Because the world of AI changes data from a commodity like oil, right, which is, here's a thing of value that we can extract and use, to something that's much more sophisticated and multi-headed, right? That data has value certainly when it reflects me personally, that it has new value when it can be combined with your data and the data of millions of others, and even newer value when you can take that and use it to train an AI model that then might generate value for somebody else.
Right.
I'm not sure I have any answers for you.
That's fine.
But I think there are new questions that are emerging that actually are quite interesting, right? How do we think about data as a projection of power? And how do we come up with new ways to think about the governance of that power? There's lots of interesting research happening in the world today, and I'll spare you kind of the full catalog. But let me tell you a couple of things that I think are really interesting here. The first is to think about the geopolitics of data. To think about many countries that in their first response to this have said, what we want is border-based sovereignty over data. That we just don't want to share it outside of our borders. And if you're a commercial provider that wants to work with the data about our people, you have to come into our country and establish the capacity to do it there. As you might imagine, this has really good second and third order effects for economic growth, for employment. But at the same time, it creates new barriers to the free flow of data.
Right.
And it means that those countries that have the capital and the capacity to invest in, kind of within country capacity mean that they get a leg up. And I think there's a challenge there. And the second thing I'll share with you on this that I think is just so important for us to acknowledge is, even though the world today feels like it's rife with data, we use that term all the time, nearly all of the data collected in the world today was collected for commercial purpose.
Right.
We know so much about the subsurface level cobalt, copper, zinc, and mining deposits across much of West Africa.
Okay.
And yet we know so little about the surface availability of safe and potable drinking water.
Right.
In that phenomenon is something that's quite core. Today we collect data because somebody thought it might be economically worth something someday. What about all the other facets of the human experience that are about human welfare? Right. About access to safe water, to safe health, to economic value comes from agriculture. And who will collect that in order to train the AIs of the future? This, to me, is a massive question that also creates an incredible opportunity for public engagement with AI. To say, we want to start collecting this data because it represents all of us. Right. We want to collect it because it might drive amazing solutions to some of the world's greatest problems. And that we know that while we'll have partnership from the private sector, this is a definable area where government and public capital can have an amazing outcome attached to it.
It sounds like there's some agency issues here that are coming up throughout the conversation. Who has agency to set the rules, to build the mechanisms, to make the connective tissue, et cetera. I think that, we so often are reactive and not proactive on these points. You've suggested that multilateral institutions might be able to help us become more proactive. But of course, they're all powered by sovereign governments, right, who have their own competing priorities and interests. Are you seeing any place where the priorities and interests are aligning in those sovereign countries in ways that might suggest a really transformative policy impact in the coming, let's say, 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think we've seen already some progress, and I don't want to discount that. And then I am quite hopeful about the future, but you'll see that's a trademark of mine, right? But I'll tell you where we've already seen incredible progress, starting in 2019 with international and multilateral organizations coming together to ask questions about not just the technical implementation, but about the social and moral consequences of these tools. In 2019, UNESCO came forward with the ethics principles around AI, which were adopted by 194 countries, right? Truly multilateral and universal in its approaches. And those guidelines have now gone on to shape all kinds of activities at national level and even in the private sector.
Do you have any good examples of that? Because I feel like so often we're talking about these things that happen in multilateral institutions in very abstract ways. Like we've agreed to a set of principles, everybody's agreed to it, but then tell us about the next step. Like
absolutely.
What is the next step inside a country to make those principles active and how they're developing this ecosystem?
I love this question. This is actually what I often say is I know that we need to start with normative values and principles, but then what happens?
Yeah.
So in this particular case, I'll actually tell you the next step of it because it's been so incredibly powerful. Okay. In a partnership with UNESCO and a few other institutions, we've actually created a new methodology called a rapid assessment methodology that countries can use to actually take the principles that are enshrined in the UNESCO document and turn it into an assessment of nation-level capacity around AI. This starts with technical capacity, but it also looks at the socio-legal capacity of a country to regulate AI, to think about where there are centers of excellence that actually have the capacity to create proactive visions, and to develop an infrastructure and assessment that says, here's where we are in the journey, and set goals about where we want to get to.
Right.
Now, across 60 plus countries where the RAM has now been applied, that's led to an entire suite of approaches that range from legislative action, where parliaments have actually passed new rules and regulations, strategic planning in ministries of economic planning and development, right? Statements about data sovereignty and privacy inside of countries, and in deep partnership with technology companies, a change in practice about how we do things like safety by design. We work with organizations that are often working on thorny issues like child sexual material. And how we actually work with AI providers to say, let's look at regional differentiation as jurisdictional approaches to legislative action around child pornography, and tie that into the ways that we're actually designing the systems so that there's no way that a commercially available generative AI system might be used to create child pornography. So it really is a whole of society approach. And here is the nugget of the answer to your broader question around agency. Is I don't think that we'll be able to shape the contours of this new world exclusively by national regulation. The nature of AI is too cross-border. We won't be able to shape it exclusively through multilateral action because, as you said, there are many competing sovereign interests there. And the nature of kind of impact of those instruments are limited by definition. And I can tell you, we certainly won't get there exclusively by voluntary commitments from private sector companies. But if I say none of these are independently sufficient, I do believe that taken together, they might actually give us a patchwork and a framework approach to actually look at the whole of society impacts of an AI transformation, to add in civil society, to add in community-based voices, to even add in faith-based traditions and interesting elements of our human and cultural society that actually maybe feel quite far away from AI. I mentioned that I recently came from a meeting at the Vatican. Over the last few years, faith-based communities have stepped forward to build things like faith-based principles on AI development that ask fundamental questions about what's the role of human decision-making when it comes to matters of spirituality, and how does AI intersect with it. We're seeing philosophers and humanists, we're seeing artists and creators engage in the conversation. And I'll tell you, Rorry, I think it still is happening a little too quietly. Because when I pick up the New York Times or the Washington Post or the FT or the Guardian or international papers, the headlines still want to focus on the newest, best, biggest models that are out there. And a small set of people that I think of as committed evangelists for a very particular view of how AI might change society. Those views often center technology. They talk about the ways that technological innovation and new models will create new cornucopias, will solve problems, will somehow fix the ills that we as humanity face. I'm glad that those people exist. Many of them are very dear friends of mine because they demonstrate to me a great aspiration and optimism about what human innovation can do in technology. But to me, that's not the whole story. In fact, if we just told that story without doing any of the other work that we've talked about in our conversation, we'd have really shining, gleaming technology tools and we'd have a world that would face deep inequality and injustice, a world where people felt powerless and felt like technology was happening without them.
Right.
It maybe sounds a little familiar to some of what we face in the world today. But there's an alternative, right? We've talked about so many elements of it. At its core, as you said, is creating a world where we actually distribute power and decision-making to everyone, where we say technological innovation is great, but we actually need to bring them to where people face struggle and challenge, where we use public capital in the form of tax revenues, sure, but also philanthropic capital, of intellectual capacity, of the institutions we've already built to guide us into a better future, to say, let's take AI and make it a part of a concerted approach.
Right.
And to make sure that we do that in ways that are global in their ethical frameworks and in our common commitments, but highly local and regional in respecting cultural values, in making sure that we shape a cornucopia of approaches that actually let us say, not that this is a uniquely African or Asian approach, but rather one that represents communities, how they choose to define their political identities, and actually let us have many different approaches that converge to one global future.
I mean, that's a future I think all of us would really like to participate in, because it's one that can use these tools and particularly spread the agency throughout society to use these tools in ways that could create a little bit more of a harmonious society. What kind of lessons can you draw from your experience in coming to these solutions in a sustainable way? I think we're also, one aspect of these massive kind of data models is that they still use so much power. So much electricity goes into powering this AI ecosystem. And we're not at a place, at least for now, in the global international order where renewables are powering much of that system. It's still relying on emissions-heavy industry to do this computing power. So how do we kind of solve for that type of issue where at this point all of the kind of amazing benefits that we've discussed would also lead to an unsustainable climate crisis?
Yeah, with AI in particular, and I said this early in our conversation, we are very much still in the very early days of even conceptualizing what an AI-driven future looks like.
Yeah.
And we have to be quite careful not to take the realities of today and use them to ground inevitability predictions about the future. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Today, as we've talked about a few times, technology companies are saying the pathway to progress in AI is to make ever more complicated, large, and sophisticated models, right? We started with models that had parameters in the millions, and they were in the billions. Now we talk about the trillions. We have technology leaders going around and talking about how we need to invest trillions of dollars in new chips and data. But again, as somebody who's been a technologist and an expert in the space for 25 years, if you'd asked us 25 years ago, we didn't know that the insight was more data into these models. That was a relatively new kind of academic approach to building this. That is the version of AI we are in today. There is no academic proof that says this is the version of AI we'll have in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. We're actually so at the cusp of massive technological breakthroughs that we actually don't know what the right set of next responses might be. Okay, so if we say, first of all, let's just be sure to not assume too much about what the future needs of data and power will be. That's a starting point. The second is, we've spoken a little bit about this idea of small and decentralized models. What comes with them also is lower needs for power in both running the models and training them and in the inference costs associated with them. And the third is an interesting opportunity. As we think about building new data centers and building the infrastructure of a digital world, what's happening today is still early movers, primarily from the private sector, going in and in very fragmented ways, kind of developing the infrastructure they want to power their own companies. Now, I wonder if we asked a different question. What would it look like to build computing and data access as a public infrastructure? How would we align practices to ensure that we were centering sustainability in everything from certainly the power usage of the chips themselves, but also into the land practices about where a data center is situated, the ways that we think about transmission lines and power loss, the ways that we actually apply what we have come to learn about really great design of power systems in this space that's attracted massive amounts of capital and could potentially become a test bed for innovation. Now, all of this goes to this question of AI's intervention as a user of power. But let's also talk about the flip side of the coin.
Right.
One of the many projects that we work with that I think is really incredible in this space is using AI to understand the behaviors of people who access the grid to better optimize how and when we turn on older technologies around coal and gas versus using renewable power on the grid.
Right.
It turns out that using AI to optimize a power grid can actually itself be a massive increase or a massive improvement in how we actually build these grids at scale. Then you take that one step further and you think about all the ways that AI can be used to optimize power usage, power consumption, power creation, and the underlying supply chains of oil extraction and coal extraction, all of the other pieces. And there's a suggestion here that all of the uses of electricity for AI could be offset by the efficiencies that are created by using AI to optimize energy.
Well, that's definitely also a future I would like to live in. I think that we, again, like we've had this really wide-ranging conversation about not just the risk of AI, but also the opportunities and benefits. In your ideal world, what would society look like in 20 years? Let's just take that. Like it's about 2050, let's say. And we've been working on this problem set for another 25 years. What's like the North Star for you? Like, where do you want to see the world at that time?
Yeah, I love this question, Rorry. As you have seen throughout this conversation, I am generally an optimist about the future. I grew up reading a lot of science fiction and envisioning what the world would look like. And if you ask me, maybe in 25 years we'll have jetpacks, because that's always been a dream of mine since the time I was reading, Tom Swift books.
Well, as someone who takes New Jersey Transit, I would definitely welcome that.
But let me give you a more serious answer.
Okay.
And I'm not going to speculate on what technology will enable for humanity. We have plenty of that out there. But let me tell you about the contours of a world that I really want to live in, where technology plays an incredible role in actually inspiring what makes us most human. Here are a few things that I would really look for. One is an evolution of our political systems in a way that recenters our voice in individual and community hands, that makes sure that we all feel a capacity to participate and an agency in guiding macro decisions and micro. Not merely about technology use, but about all of the other collective decisions we make about shared welfare. A society where we no longer say that economic scarcity means that we have to make very tough decisions about who participates and who gains. Yeah. About a world where inequality is seen as a necessary consequence of the economic system we have. A world where the capacity to build solutions to our greatest problems is felt by everyone everywhere. That in every community, there's a sense that we can build the tools we need to address our local problems, and a trust in the idea that our governments and our public institutions are coming together to address our global scale challenges in exactly the same way. Now, that might seem very rosy. Let me tell you what I see as the challenges for us to get there.
Okay.
The first is, I want to be super clear, this vision of a world where everybody participates equitably isn't necessarily in everybody's best interests. There are political systems and economic systems that are very much grounded in actually limiting people's agency in order to maintain political power. And I think one of the great challenges of the next decade will be the fight at an international scale of core conceptions and ideas about what kind of relationship we want to see between citizens and their governments. I think those core ideological differences will be expressed most poignantly in battles over technology, about access, about products, about the underlying chips, but also in how we deploy them in our societies. Whether we use rights-based approaches and we think about technologies that are deployed in ways that reflect cultural norms, or whether we deploy them in ways that center existing institutions of power, maybe at the detriment of the citizens of that country. I think that's one. And the second is, I think, whether we will really commit to this idea and conviction that technology can be used for public purpose. I think we see a real core decision that we're going to have to make in our economic system about whether we're comfortable and content with the idea that private and profit-seeking actors are the only ones who build technologies for the future, or whether we'll make a real commitment to investing public interest and public capital to build public purpose AI.
Well, you can follow all of Vilas's great work at the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation and our work at ASPI for exploring exactly these questions. What is the government role in tech integration in society, and how do we come to this future where we are, really enhancing and emphasizing the connections that we have to each other to create trust through some of these tech tools. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you. We need some optimism right now in this world. I'm glad you delivered it. It's a wonderful way to start the new year.
Thank you so much, Rorry. A delight.